Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. We're here in the great space in the sky, I guess we are, especially today. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas. Welcome to everyone. We're so happy to see you all there at the start of this fourth special event that's part of our community of the imagination, which is under the Volcano's way of inviting all of you, readers and writers, to be part of a new way of connecting across distances, borders, boundaries, cultural, ethnic, linguistic, in terms of genre, gender, the whole works. So before we begin, I want to tell you that today's conversation, which is called Speculation Matters, kind of takes up the thread from our amazing conversation a week ago with astrophysicist Priyambada Natarajan and three novelists called Black Holes, The Lure of the Unknown. Today we're taking that into the realm overtly of science fiction and speculation on a whole range of related wonderful ideas to consider. This panel specifically was the inspiration of our very dear friend and colleague Nelly Rosario. And I'm sorry that Nelly can't be with us today. I hope she's watching. She may be watching, but her daughter Olivia, who's a brilliant medical student, had major surgery yesterday, and it just wasn't humanly possible, even for superhuman Nelly, to join us today. So we miss her, and we thank her in advance for what I know is going to be an amazing conversation. So before I slip out of you myself, which is a great privilege, I want to introduce the three people who are going to be conversing today. And they are, first of all, Sheree Renée Thomas, over there, top of my screen. There you are. About whom I've heard for so many years, especially from Nelly. Sheree is a novelist herself, a short story writer, an editor, and an anthologist. And along with that, has been a visionary leader in a lot of the institutional frameworks and reviews and conferences that hold together the world of, I will use these words advisedly, and you can all correct me, fantasy and science fiction. Sheree is right now the new editor of the venerable magazine Fantasy and Science Fiction. She's also the associate editor of Obsidian, Literature and Arts in the African Diaspora, which goes back to 1975. So she's also the editor of the groundbreaking anthology Dark Matters, and that came out in the year 2000. So I think it's fair to characterize the work and her as prophetic, in as much as that field has so flourished in the 20s, the 2 decades since the turn of the millennium. Wow, yes, we are in the 21st century. And Sheree's own work is widely anthologized, appearing most recently, I'm turning to look at notes, forgive me, The Big Book of Modern Fantasy in Marvel's Black Panther, and has also come out in Transition and the New York Times, and she has a book very recently out, just last year, called 9 Bar Blues, Stories from an Ancient Future. So you see where this is going. Sheree was honored as a 2020 World Fantasy Award Finalist for her contributions to the genre, and she's going to be the special guest and co-host along with Malka Older this year at the 2021 Hugo Awards. Now I'm turning to Jumko Ogata. I hope that she will forgive me for casting her as a kind of avatar and maybe torchbearer of the next generation. Jumko Ogata is from Veracruz, Mexico, but she was raised in California. She writes fiction, essays, and movie critiques in both English and Spanish, and has been published by the Revista de la Universidad in Vogue, Mexico. She's currently a columnist for Cool Hunter MX, so I'm sure it's very cool. I'm sure it's cutting edge because it's digital and it's online. Her work focuses on identity, racialization, and racism in Mexico. She's taught anti-racism workshops for Facebook, Twitter, and Mexico's Department of Culture, as well as for nonprofits in Mexico and the US, And Jumko Ogata is currently writing her undergraduate thesis on Latin American studies at the University of Mexico, UNAM. All of this conversation is going to be moderated and held together by my dear colleague, Gabriela Damián Miravete, whom most of you have already seen in action. She not only helps to keep the lava of our volcano flowing, but is also an award-winning fiction writer and essayist with a strong predilection for science, science fiction, and speculative writing. Gabi teaches master-level courses on the relationship between film and literature in Mexico City at Centro. She's also a founding member of the art and science collective Cúmulo de Tesla. Her recent essay, not yet translated into English, Misión en órbita, los Africano-futuros, which appeared in the Mexican journal Gato Pardo just this past January, is a groundbreaking look at the work of Afro-descendiente writers across the Americas. Should be translated. Take note. Her short story, They Will Dream in the Garden, originally published as Soñarán en el Jardín by Latin American Literature Today, won the 2018 prestigious James Tiptree Jr. Award. It's a tongue twister. The James Tiptree Award, given annually to works of science fiction or fantasy that explore and expand gender roles, for which Gabi received $1,000, original artwork, and chocolate. So, señoras, I turn the stage over to you. Looking forward greatly. Welcome, everyone. You want to keep your mics off. We're happy to see your faces. And we'll have questions at the end via the chat.
Thank you, Magda. Muchas gracias, querida Magda, for that warmly introduction. And I'm gonna only say a tiny bit in Spanish. Por favor, si tienen preguntas, las pueden poner en español en el chat y desde luego las haremos llegar a nuestras ponentes. Well, changing to English back. Thank you so much, Sheree and Jumko, for being here. I am thrilled to have this conversation with you because I think in this moment that we are thinking a lot about the future, it's time to recognize our identities and our heritage also, especially yours that have been like groundbreaking work since much earlier than people used to thought about Afrofuturism, African futurism. And I'm going to ask you a few questions about that, but not only in the landscape of the genre. You can answer as widely as you can. Well, one of the things I love from the remarkable historic anthology Magda mentioned, Dark Matter, your anthology, your work, Sheree, is the dark matter metaphor. You say in the introduction that Black people's presence and influence in culture is like dark matter. It's invisible, but you can definitely feel its influence, the gravitational pull of it. So, and this question, this is a question for both of you. If we could bring that influence into light, as you did with the stories of so many writers from the past and that moment and the future, let's say, what would we see in cultural terms? I mean, how we can perceive the influence of the African diaspora in your own contexts, because I think it's important to say that these are two very different contexts, but that metaphor of the invisibility of that influence, very, very powerful, but very still not so visible, is present in both cultures, but in such different ways, maybe. So I would like to start with you first, Sheree, and then Jumko.
Thank you so much. First of all, hello to everyone. Greetings from Memphis, Tennessee. I hope that you all are doing well. It's a pleasure to be here, and Nellie is a dear old friend of mine. We took classes many years ago in New York City together as fiction writers, so it's just wonderful coming full circle. For me, the dark matter metaphor worked well for me at that time because having worked, I'm just gonna say I wore two hats. I was also a writer, but also an editor, and I worked at Random House. And so I was a part of the editorial meetings that would take place each week at the time. It was on Mondays. And I worked at One World Books, which was the first multicultural imprint at one of the major Big Five publishing houses, which is still publishing now, publishing the works of Ta-Nehisi Coates and Tim Fielder and others. It was started by at least, I believe, 5 Black women at the time, and they published multicultural work from indigenous writers, spiritual work, fiction, nonfiction, all kinds of things that you can think of. At the time, the conversation about science fiction was centered on 2 writers, and mostly just one, to be honest, because they didn't always remember to think of Samuel R. Delany, who was the first Black writer to actually make a career in science fiction. But they would always think of Octavia E. Butler. So depending on who you ask, those were the 2 writers that they would think of as being in the field. And that was pretty much it. That was the conversation. They didn't believe that our community read science fiction widely, like they didn't believe we read romances or any of the other works. And I always say, I would be so baffled by that because my family was very much into science fiction and fantasy and horror. And I was telling Magda when we spoke that I believe that at least my family helped Stephen King have one family vacation at some point in his life. I mean, based on the volume of books. And so this ideal of, you know, writers not often, or artists not being aware who are the people who are part of their bottom line, just because they don't see them and in fandom, or they're not necessarily going to be at your book signing that you have somewhere, or they may not, you know, be at the conventions or in costumes or whatever. I had working class parents who were civil servants, and they couldn't take off work for those things. We didn't have comic books stores, you know, that I could just walk over to and be a part of fandom in that way. But we read everything, and it was in the house. So, so the ideal being, you know, an invisible force is something that I was kind of conscious of already before I found the NASA jet propulsion site to find the term that I wanted to use to describe this work. In terms of the cultural influence, I would say it's like so many of our, you know, of our community. A lot of the things that you think of as, you know, classically American. And I'm just thinking of music. I'm in Music City right now. Memphis, is born and raised in Memphis. Crossroads of the blues, rock and roll, soul, all of that. The people who made that work are Black Americans. That's who did it. And it became part of the world's conversation. It's part of the dialogue that people everywhere has been able to innovate and add their own cultural influence and introduce us to their, you know, wonderful, you know, indigenous music and things. And it's all a part of that. So that ideal of Black culture being this kind of lingua franca that the whole world somehow, you know, gets a hold to at some point, and then it becomes mainstream to the point where sometimes they forget where it came from, the origins of it. And that's, you could, you know, lots of communities around the world can, you know, have had that experience. That was also a part of it as well. But there were more than 2 writers writing science fiction and fantasy. We had been writing it in English since the 1850s in independent Black presses, interestingly enough, which is kind of a, almost an extinct community at this point. They're fighting very hard to stay on. So this work was very rooted with liberation struggles at the time, which was, of course, again, shaped this country where I am, that history. The idea of who is free and who is not, who is this country for, what is the destiny of it? All of that was deeply in the conversation before it was even a country, when it was being approached, you know, colonized you know, and taken from the communities, the nations who were here already. All of that was a part of the conversation. And when they finally became, you know, the United States of America, here we were again, this group of people who had no true solid identity in the country, legally or otherwise. And then they began to codify that otherness as a part of how they would shape the country. So I feel like the cultural influence is so intrinsic that it's very difficult to even talk about this nation without having us be a part of that conversation at all. And in terms of classic science fiction work, the proto-science fiction writing that I'm thinking of is Martin Delany, who was no relation to Samuel R. Delany, but also Pauline E. Hopkinson, who knew W.E. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. They were friends, and she would often kind of mediate their arguments and conversations about what's the best strategy for the future in terms of that liberation struggle, as well as Sudden E. Griggs, who spent some time here in Memphis as well. Their work was about uniting with Cuba in one novel, having a successful uprising based out of a person, out of love, actually, out of a wife being sold away into slavery, and this man fighting to save his wife, and in the course of that, inspiring people to get free all through the South and uniting with Cuba and taking over Texas. It's like a crazy, like wild alternative history story, you know. But that's the earliest science fiction before I went and re-identified W.E. Du Bois's work as science fiction, which, you know, first sociologists in the country, actually created the field, studied in Germany and other places, and just made a big influence wherever he went. But he was also an artist, and he wrote poems, and he wrote romances, and he wrote prayers and songs, and he wrote classic golden age science fiction. The Comet is the one that I published first in Dark Matter, A Century of Speculative Fiction from the African Diaspora. And then Jesus Christ in Texas was the second one, because I didn't know I was going to be able to do a second one. So I just, you know, I had those on deck, and they of course have found other stories since then in his archives, but the work was never discussed as science fiction, even though it is, as Magda was saying, it's very speculative, and he was looking at the current political realm that he was in, and, you know, and trying to make a story that would resonate in terms of what would happen if a comet came and hit, you know, the nation, and you think that you're the last person on Earth, right? And you're stumbling around and you find another person, but you've been in this, like this very segregated society, but you guys got to survive. So just when the characters, the white woman and the black character, began to sort of have some peace and decide that they're going to try to survive together, then they hear the voices of the white men in the background. And it's almost like a lynch mob is going to happen. And so you realize you've been in this kind of post-apocalyptic setting, and now you're pulled back in this story to, you know, the racism that was rooted in the very origins of the country centuries ago. So that was a wonderful story. Jesus Christ in Texas was a story where Jesus comes back, he's black, he's in Texas. Of course, you already know what, you know, they don't recognize him, and it doesn't go well. Let's put it like that. That story is relevant in 2021, you know.
100 years later.
Yeah, so those are just the roots of that particular project. But like I said, the cultural impact is just like the group of writers that I was so fortunate to be able to work with. They had multiple stories, some of them sent me, totally different genres. They've sent science fiction and fantasy or horror. And depending on what I chose, you could have had a whole different conversation about that work, you know. But it has completely shaped, and I'm not shy about saying it, I'll just say for some of the listeners out there, I think it's very important that women artists are cited for the work that they do in real time. And I think it's important because not only is it a matter of accuracy and record keeping, but when you erase people's contributions, it gets kind of reinscribed because other people are not always as diligent. And so they just repeat the error. And so I've been quiet for a long time about dark matter and just kind of quietly doing my work. And I was reading a lot of more scholarship, and I noticed that suddenly it was like a common thing. Everybody knew W.B. Du Bois was a science fiction writer. Skid, you know, let's skip the record. That was a complete, not a common conversation at all. And in fact, it was kind of a battle because there's a lot of opinions about the genre and that predate us altogether, about what is literature, what is literary, what is not. The work that they love, they pull it out and it becomes a classic. They love Ursula Le Guin, they love H.G. Wells, they love George Orwell, we can go on and on, but it's not considered literature. And yet you have these amazing writers who have all written in the field. I would argue that our earliest work is speculative fiction and fantasy, certainly from drama and theater. Magical realism comes right out of Cuba and the history of Haiti, right? I don't want to go into a whole conversation about that, but there was a reason why W.E. Du Bois's science fiction was sitting on the shelf for years, it published, and it wasn't being taught as science fiction. It wasn't being discussed. So when I did that, I knew I was taking a risk. When I put the collection together, I knew I was taking a risk. But that's what we need to do. And I think it's important to be aware of that and to take note of the type of contributions that women make in our fields. And if you need to set the record straight, don't be afraid to do so. And don't assume that others are going to do it for you. So I just wanted to say that. Yeah.
Thanks, Sheree. Yeah, because I think just a little note here because it's pertinent. Yeah, a lot of merit that comes that is due to science fiction and fantasy and speculative fiction are erased because it's not serious literature. And there are a lot of things that come from this field that push up the boundaries of culture in general. It's another kind of dark matter. We are influencing the culture in ways that later, much later, become mainstream, and that is not recognized. So thank you for saying that, and particularly for women. So let's listen to Jumko.
Well, first of all, I hope you can't hear the construction going on beside me too much. I couldn't be helped, but to go into the metaphor of dark matter, I found it was also very relevant for talking about speculative fiction, Black speculative fiction in Mexico, because there are no Black Mexican writers that belong to the literary canon. And even as a Black population, we were erased from the national narrative and from history and from our history being taught in schools ever since the independence. We had our first Black president during the beginning of the 19th century, but he was whitened in order to be more palatable for the white elites. And we're barely just getting back all of these narratives. So I think even going back to these and imagining the stories of all of these important Black people in our country as part of this work of speculative writing. Also, there's the case of an African man that was enslaved and that rebelled and that had a whole community of escaped people here in my home state in Veracruz, Yanga. And there's not much about him. There's a lot about the revolts and all the negotiations from all the things concerning the European side, the colonizer side, but we don't know where he was from, what his name was. And here I'd like to shout out Ariana Brown, who is a Black poet, and she has actually begun writing about Yanga, imagining. She actually has a beautiful poem called What I Imagine What Yanga Would Have Looked Like. And I think it's also a way of trying to trace back our own roots, our own histories, and not resigning ourselves. It's something that I'm paraphrasing Toni Morrison, but when we don't have these actual histories, we can imagine what could have happened, and that is also part of our history. That act of imagination is also a way of trying to trace back our origin. And in my own personal situation, being Black and being of Asian descent, Black and Asian separately are not recognized populations in Mexico. Me being both, I always live this act of being signaled out or being pointed out as an other wherever I am, and always thinking, oh, where are you from? Oh, how long has your family been here? Oh, you're so exotic. When my whole family has been born and raised in Mexico for more than 3 generations. And yet we are never going to be perceived as what Sheree was saying. We have this history in our countries, but the official history is so violent with us that it does not let us, it does not recognize us as part of. And when we are recognized, it's from the narratives of people that are not part of our communities and try to talk over us. And that's also an important part of Black Mexican, not only writers, but also filmmakers, reclaiming the voices of our own communities and trying to show how we would define ourselves instead of how others would define us. In this sense, I also believe speculative fiction is very important for us because exactly what Sheree was mentioning about magical realism being born in this region, it's very interesting because to us, well, at least me growing up with my grandmother, she would always tell me stories of creatures that were similar to those told by Nalo Hopkinson in the first Dark Matter anthology, just that they have other names. Now, instead of Sukuyan, we call them Nahuales. And I thought it was so funny. Like, this is like, I know these creatures. My grandmother would tell me, yeah, my aunt used to be one of these, and her husband had to burn her skin. Like, to me, this isn't magic realism. This is just real, and that's it. And that's also part of our reclaiming of our narratives. From a Western gaze, these things seem so impossible and so part of fiction that we as in this case Black and Indigenous and Asian communities in Mexico are like, no, this is just our realism. If you haven't been exposed to these realities, that's on you. But this is part of our way of understanding the world, of living through the world, and just trying to appreciate all of these stories that have been, well, people tell us that they're lies, or, oh, you shouldn't believe that, that's just superstitious. And it's not. And I also think another important part of these conversations is appreciating the value of oral histories, because just as science fiction and fantasy genres aren't taken seriously because they're not real literature, oral history also has been discounted as, oh, that's not, you can't write it, oh, it's stories, tales. And so much of Indigenous and African storytelling is oral, and we have such important characters as a griot in West Africa that is a storyteller, a historian that knows everything by memory, right? And so many of the elders in our own communities are a sort of griot. And writing down those stories is also a way of trying to share with people who have been disconnected from their communities because of migration. A lot of people have had to migrate to the US and have been disconnected from their communities. So this is a way of trying to reconnect and see how all of this is transformed. As well, for those of us who have grown up in bilingual, bicultural sort of context, this is also a way to reclaim the validity of our own use of language. I've been seeing a lot of stories that I'm actually working on a script right now with a grant by a Netflix grant with a Blaxican friend on speculative fiction concerning what would happen if the border didn't exist, if we could just cross freely, or what would happen if, for example, thinking of Guatemala, there was no genocide that made all of these people move. what would happen if you didn't have to leave your community? Because that's the other thing, right? A lot of people think migration is a sort of waking up one day and thinking, oh, I don't like it here anymore, let's try something new. And in reality, it's a profoundly violent and painful process of having to sort of deroot, if that makes sense, your whole life in order to try to survive, truly. So I believe speculative fiction, and just that as an umbrella term, is very valuable for us as, in my case, a Black and Asian person, writer in Mexico, because I'm trying to trace back all of those stories that have been denied to me. It doesn't mean, the fact that there aren't any important Mexican writers doesn't mean that we haven't existed. It means that we haven't been able to be published. It means that the manuscripts we've written have been destroyed or have been hidden or have been stolen by others. So that's a bit of my take on the importance of the dark matters comparison. And on the other hand, the cultural influence is that I do not connect with any of the Mexican literature I've read, and I've read quite a lot, because these people are just live in very different contexts. The canon, the literary canon, is white men and women that live in Mexico City or in that area, or in semi-desert ecosystems. And I grew up in the tropics. I grew up in the Mexican, it's called the Great Caribbean. I grew up surrounded by Black people. I wasn't confronted with my Blackness because it was never something that differentiated me from others around me, until I went to Mexico City, where people would be like, oh, you're so exotic, you're not from here, are you? And it's like, what? So in that sense, I have found much more or a deeper connection with writers from all over the African diaspora, not only because of their experiences with racism or with how a Black woman moves through the world, but just how we connect with our communities, how stories are passed down generation after generation. And I'd like to shout out an example like Autobiography of My Mother by Jamaica Kincaid. She's a Black writer from Antigua. Or I Tituba by Maris Conde, who is a Guadalupean writer. All of these stories resonate much more with my personal experience, the way I have lived in the tropics, than the stories of people from central Mexico, because then again, the whole idea of a country is very much an artificial construct, and these national identities don't really serve me as a Black Asian person from Veracruz. So as well, the Dark Matters anthology, like I was saying, Nalo Hopkinson, resonated much more with me, even though their story is set in the West Indies, in these islands in the Caribbean, because this is the region that we belong to, and this is the region that works for me. And the only time I've seen fiction talk about Black Mexican people, and I mean like older fiction, not anything from the last couple of years, is a fantastic and enormous work by Afro-Colombian writer Manuel Zapata Olivella. He has a novel that is titled Changó el Gran Putas, which is just like this enormous narration of the Yoruba pantheon of all of the spirits and the orishas, and how the African kidnapping and enslavement of peoples in the Americas led to all of these rebellion or all of these these movements of rebellion. And he talks about one of Mexico's, again, whitened Black important characters that helped us gain independence, Jose Maria Morelos. And he talks about Morelos being guided by one of the orishas. So I found all of these stories to be beautiful because they connect us. And here I'd also like to shout out Afro-Brazilian writer Conceição Evaristo. She talks about, instead of looking towards, for example, Greek mythology to try to construct our speculative fiction or to have it inform our way of understanding the world, why not turning towards something that is more relevant to our own communities, like the Yoruba way of seeing the world, like all of the orishas and all of these spirits, because we're not white, we're not European, so why would we want to understand ourselves in these in these frameworks, in these cosmovisions, if you will. So I believe that there is also a great sense of seeing myself mirrored in narratives by other people from the African diaspora, because we have all of these similarities in our histories and in our experiences and in our way of understanding the world.
Thank you both of you. I think in this way, representation is a big issue. And one of the things that have inspired the world by means of Afro-futurism or African futurism is that representation matters. And I think, for example, in Latin America, in Mexico, or even the Afro-Latin American communities are inspired by that representation, that possibility of being there. Like we said in our previous talk that Magda mentioned, writing ourselves in the future, writing these communities in the future. So I perceive a lot of common threads here. Even that Mexican context is very different than the US context related to Afro-descendants and Afro-heritage. But I think community representation are two main themes. And also the being able to rewrite, not only write the future, but also rewriting the past, like rethinking and rewriting a lot of things that may not happen, that may be possible, as you were saying with that beautiful Toni Morrison quote, but also reconsidering and rediscovering, or maybe unearthing and put into light a lot of discoveries, like Sheree was mentioning, like W.E.B. Du Bois, that it's a very important figure and very serious figure, and the role of the imagination, this kind of imagination in his work, he chose it because of a reason. So I think there are a lot of interesting things happening because of these common themes. So I want to ask you both, what do you think, you mentioned it before, but what do you think this is, why speculative fiction allows you to do that? What's the mechanism that allows you the possibility to rewrite the past, to unearth things and put it in common and rethink your communities, parting of that idea to the future? What do you think it's in order here? And what do you enjoy the most? Maybe if you could share to us, what do you allow yourselves to imagine now for the past and for the future of your communities? It would be wonderful. So Sheree?
Hi, that's a wonderful question. I know I keep talking about magical realism, but I keep thinking of Alejo Carpentier. He's a historian initially, right? But he is the founder of the marvelous real, right? And he coined the term because he was actually trying to write a historical work using the strategies and the techniques of a historian and all the historiography that comes with that, to talk about the independence movement in Haiti, it being one of the first places of a successful slave uprising. The whole nation gets free, right? And so he wanted to write about that. But when he began to study the oral histories that we were talking about, that the Jumko was talking about early, he realized that there is a point where the historical record or the tools of a historian were insufficient to tell that amazing story that started with the power of a woman who had a spiritual role in the community, who did a ritual calling upon the orishas or the loas that Jumko was talking about earlier. And it's the same Black gods. It's the same Black gods. They just, the people travel to different parts of the world and they celebrated them there. But in Haiti, it's voodoo. So they had a voodoo ritual. And that is what inspired the people to feel like they had their gods behind them to support something that they knew innately. They didn't have to ask anyone that they should be free. They knew it naturally. They're humans. They knew that. And so they had the courage to overcome the machete, the musket, death to do so. And they ran the French out of there, right? And so when he started to write it, the questions that he had, the answers were not going to work with just realism or mimetic fiction, right? So the wonderful thing about speculative fiction as a tool is that it allows you to ask what all artists do, what if, right? What if? And the answer is only limited by your imagination, right? And it gives you a lot more room and range to board across in your imagination, to mix things together and to pull different techniques. And so that's what he did to write Kingdom of This World, which was his novel of the Haitian independence. And he created a new form in that, magical realism, because as was said earlier, for a lot of cultures, what they believe is not fiction. What they believe is real. That is how they see the world. It's the lens. So speculative fiction is that lens. When I was working on 9 Bar Blues, one of the things that I wanted to think about, because I'm in a place, a part of the city that has a lot of historical significance. I'm a block away from the National Civil Rights Museum, which is the Lorraine Motel where Dr. King was murdered. I am half a block away from an 1866 mass massacre that took place that was instigated by the Memphis police against freedmen because they were unhappy with the economic competition that was going to happen, and Black Union soldiers being stationed in Memphis. Well, I began to wonder if you were in that period and you wanted to get free and you didn't know how, you didn't have that ability necessary. And there's so many ways you could be a subversive, you could subvert it in other quiet ways, but if you wanted to get free, what could you do? And I came up with this magical book that an enslaved woman, she takes from a woman planter, who's like a very rare thing. She was alone, had her own planter, and she was doing a very dark magic with this book. But this woman took it and she created a tunnel in which she was able to take the entire population on their plantation into this tunnel, this wind tunnel, and they are transferred out of this Mississippi plantation near the Mississippi River into another time period. And all she asked when she held the book was, we want to go where we are free. The problem was everywhere they landed, there was variations of freedom, right? It wasn't exactly the freedom that she had imagined. And so she found herself time traveling. So for me, the joy of being able to do that, I could have taken it, made a straight historical, fiction tale or what have you, or treated it like a slave narrative, which is, I think it was our first, major works here outside of our music. But I wanted to take that magic and have her not just be the regular magical Negroes we see in some of the Hollywood movies and books where a person of color has power, but it's never used for their own benefit. It doesn't help them in their community. They're all alone out there. It's the Green Mile, right? And you die in the end. I wanted them to be free, but I wanted it to be a nuanced thing, to recognize and respect the fact that we're all still fighting for this, many centuries later. So this this poor woman is probably going to be traveling for a while, but my heart, I'm a hopeful person, and I want to write for love. So I made her have to stop. I made the river, actually, the Mississippi River, the spirit of the river, you know, makes her stop traveling and actually just face where she is and seek that freedom in that particular time period and live an actual life. So, and it was the hardest thing I had written in a long time, but I absolutely loved it. And in order to finish that story, I realized I couldn't tell it just through one voice. I needed her voice. I needed the river's voice. I needed the mountain's voice. I needed the statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest to speak. I needed all of those things to manifest in that story. And I could do it because it's speculative fiction. And as long as you make the world make sense, the rules of your magic make sense, you can take it wherever you want. So that's, to me, that's the fun of it. You can solve problems in ways that are a little more challenging in other forms, you know. Yeah.
Love that. Jumko?
Well, for me, speculative fiction definitely is, well, it's grounded first and foremost in past for me. The way I've dipped my toes into this is very much looking towards the past. What happened in these regions, in these communities? Why aren't our stories, registered? And then looking towards my own personal family history, finding out that there were so many loose ends, so many stories that we just knew tidbits of. And for example, my great-grandfather came here as, my Japanese great-grandfather came here as an enslaved person, and he was working in coal mines. And that's all we knew. That was it. And so part of my thesis work, like historically and rough data and all this, has been finding out more. But I realized that my work, while it was being satisfying, for example, for my grandmother, his daughter, it still left a kind of like, you know, just, And so I began to write fiction about him, about what his life might have been like, about all the stories my grandmother and her siblings told me about their relations to him. And I found that was cathartic for them, because it was a way of settling all of those emotions and all of those experiences and making sense of them and helping them come to terms with that. And in that way, it was a way of stopping these, or ending these chains of trauma that are passed on with me. And so it's looking back and saying, here's my gift to you, resolving this, and then not only ending it with me, but if I ever have children, or my cousins and the people of my family and my community, being like, here's the story so you can resolve that. What else can we imagine now that we've healed this that has happened? How can we talk about it? Because that's also part of the trauma. Many stories aren't told because they're too painful, and we don't want to talk about them because they're painful to visit. And sometimes when we do talk about them and we resolve them in ways that perhaps weren't real or true, but that could have happened, and that are a way that we can resolve them within ourselves, then that also works. So that's why I like speculative fiction, because it helps me heal the stories in my community that have been painful to talk about, but also to imagine, now that we've healed this, what can we come up with? And especially in not only in a country, but in a worldwide context of racism against Black people, I see the little girls in the town my family is from, little Black girls, insulting themselves, calling each other Black. And what can I offer these girls so that they don't equate Blackness to being ugly or to being inferior? The world is already setting out to try to oppress them and make them feel bad, not only because they're women, but because they are Black women. And so if I, as another Black woman, an older Black woman, can show them, like, this is all BS, don't believe that, imagine, what can you imagine for yourself? What do you want to imagine for yourself? And with the thought that you can't make a new reality or create a new reality if you can't imagine it first. So I believe that's part of the why not only storytelling, but particularly speculative fiction is a good tool, because it lets you imagine anything, past, present, future, flip around, you know, two skips and a hop, and then you're in another space, time, powers, everything. So that's why I like it, because there are really no limits to what you can imagine or what you can do.
So I'm gonna make a quick question here, specifically for Jumko, because in Mexico, there's this idea of mestizaje, which is a myth. And I think it would be very interesting to dwell a little bit upon that, because it's this identity mark of Mexicans. It's harmful for this construction of the future. So really, right now, there's a very interesting cultural discussion about mestizaje, about the myth of being all this wonderful, peaceful mix. So I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit about that. And after, we have questions on the chat, so I'll refer to that.
Sure. Well, just for those of you that are with us that aren't familiar with this, the national identity of Mexico was carefully built towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, with this national myth, like in order to pull together all of these very diverse, culturally, ethnically, linguistically diverse areas into one big chunk called Mexico. The national narrative that was developed was, okay, so we are all mestizos, we are all a mix, if you will, and we are all the result of the mixture between Europeans and the indigenous peoples. And once more, not even recognizing how diverse all of the indigenous communities are within our country, just conflating them into one big political category, indigenous. And so that has completely, it's an attempt to homogenize the population, but also it's helpful because it cancels out any discussions on race or racism, because when you confront and say, oh, this is racist, how are we racist? We are all mixed together. We wouldn't, like, if we were racist, we'd be like the US that are right next to us. They segregate, we don't. Well, in reality, Mexico has segregated, just that there aren't explicit laws. They segregate by the silences. Again, like the dark matter. They segregate with what is not there, if that makes sense. And so part of this violence has been, like I said, not recognizing the Black communities of the Black population here and attempting to assimilate them. And many Black communities have been assimilated, but not all of them. And then now that Black communities are being recognized, there's talk about la tercera raíz, like a third root. But this narration or this narrative is also very problematic because it isn't questioning the original narrative that says that we're all a mixture. It just adds one more element. And so if we continue down that road, so are all Asian communities the fourth root? And we have a really big Lebanese community. So are they the fifth root or are they the fourth root? Like, and at one point in Mexican history, there were more Chinese immigrants than Spanish immigrants. So are they like the third and a half root? And we can go on and on. And once more, it's very racist because it thinks of race as something biological when it's really, as we know, a social category that affects the way our bodies are read in public spaces. So I've also been very adamant in making a critique, not only in my fiction, but in my film criticism and in my cultural criticism, because this narrative is still very present in Mexican literature and in Mexican storytelling and Mexican film. And we can't imagine another way to enunciate ourselves and enunciate our identities if we still stick with, oh, this romantic mestizaje idea. And sorry, just to end quickly, this mestizaje isn't under the logic of, oh, we're all mixing because we appreciate everybody and we're accepting our differences. There's an essay written by Mexican writer Jose Vasconcelos, who invented this cosmic race. And he said that all the races had to mix so that they would all become whiter, so that they would whiten themselves. And what values would this new race have, this cosmic race? Well, white values, European values. And he'd say, oh, but we won't impose them by violence, because that would be wrong, of course. They'll realize by themselves that European values are superior. So it's very, very insidious, very almost subconscious miscegenation and eugenics, finally. So that's part of also of the intense work we have to do in Mexican literature and storytelling and filmmaking, to question even the most basic of the narratives we have been taught throughout our lives.
Thank you. And I think a lot of questions raised from these kind of conversations. For example, maybe we don't have time to answer them all, but have anything changed from 20 years ago that dark matter came out to now, or really change, or just change a bit? For example, this kind of status quo perception of the state of things. Maybe we have to work harder to break these barriers that Jumko was referring. So I like to leave the conversation with a lot more questions, but we have a couple of questions from our audience, and Magda is going to read them to you. And I think you already addressed some of them, but nevertheless, Magda, please.
Yeah, I think the whole notion of dark matter we could talk about, and I'm so struck by the ways that you've already turned the concept inside and out in this conversation, so that what Jumko is talking about invisibility and silence as kind of analogous to the dark matter metaphor from Sheree's anthology. We're getting various questions, and because we have writers primarily in the audience, our participants in Under the Volcano, I thought maybe I would throw out this one from the chat, which is interesting because it's an ambitious question, from Mauricio Ruiz, asking whether when you create, assuming you do, I'm adding that, when you create fictional characters that identify as people of color, is it advisable to depict them as flawed, with both virtues and defects? Or does one run the risk of reinforcing certain stereotypes without doing that? Any tips, any advice to writers, he's asking.
Well, I attempt to answer it. In fiction, no matter what you're writing, three-dimensional, multi-dimensional, full characters that are real people that have strengths and weaknesses and aspirations and dreams and motivations are the most intriguing, interesting characters to read. They are dynamic, and they are characters that readers can resonate and connect to and identify with sometimes. And they move story because they have those issues. If they were perfect, why are we reading their story, right? You want to read about actual people who have to, encounter some things. If you are writing about people of color and you are not a person of color, then you have a lot of work to do, as you would have if you were writing about samurai culture in I don't know, 13th century Japan, and you know nothing about it. You would need to do a lot of research. And because you don't have to, if you're lucky, you have people of color around you, you might be able to find people who are willing to be beta readers for you. Those are people who just read it as a sensitivity read to get a sense if you've written something that is going to be recognized as an actual real type of person, or if you've written something that is going to be considered offensive and stereotypical. So that's just part of the work that you do as a writer. And now that we're in a whole different era of publishing. These conversations about writing the other, as Nisi Shaw and Cynthia Ward and K. Tempest Bradford have been teaching these classes online. Cynthia and Tempest had the books out for a number of years. You can order them. There are things that you can ask yourself and homework you can do on your own in the beginning process that can help you be a little more careful about that. If you're a person of color and you're writing, as they say now, your own voice, writing your own community, doesn't mean that you're not going to make mistakes, or doesn't mean that you're not going to write characters that someone else in your community might not agree with, but you have a better shot at it because you're writing from something that you know intimately yourself. And so you can kind of navigate any possible minefields that a person outside of your community might not recognize, you know, but you still have work to do. So yeah, it's better if you write a perfect character, you're probably going to write a book that's not as interesting to your readers, whoever they are. You know, we like to see people reach and grow and try. And you want to tell the story from the character that has the most to lose in the situation, the most vulnerable one, because now you have to use your imagination to get them out of that if you can. Yeah.
A great answer. Jumko, do you want to reply to that as well, or do we move on?
Yeah, just quickly, I agree with everything Sheree said. And I'd also add that I'd advise that before you start writing, you ask yourself a series of questions. Like, for example, if you're not a person that is racialized, think, why do you want to include these characters? What will be their purpose? Why do you just want to replace a white person with a person of color and just have them act the same? That might not work. So just try to think why you want to put them there, what their purpose is, and definitely, yes, they can't be perfect, because also assuming that racialized people are perfect is also violence, right? It's just as violent to think that we're terrible beings that will do evil at the first chance as to think that we are beings of light that will never do wrong. And in this sense, to have an idea of how you can put a problematic character but not represent them in a problematic way. The novel Detransition Baby by Tori Peters, who is a trans writer, talks about trans characters that are flawed and that have problems, but that doesn't mean that they're bad for being trans. It doesn't pull their trans identity as something that is intrinsically wrong. It just talks about them as people because they are people, right? So I think that's a really good book to see how you can make, because there are certainly some characters that you just want to why are they like this? But it doesn't have anything to do with the fact that they are trans. It's because they are flawed people, because we are all flawed people. So definitely check that out. And yeah, I agree with what Sheree said.
Very, very good advice to our writers. There's another question from Stella Santamaria asking you both, is it important for women writers to portray themselves in their characters? Anything on that?
I don't think it's important that you have to write autobiographical work as a fiction writer. Absolutely not. You can, you don't have to do that at all. In fact, when people are teaching fiction, they often caution students and readers not to assume that everything that you're reading is an autobiographical take from the author. A lot of times we write characters that are composites of people perhaps, or they are nothing at all like the people that we know or who we are. Of course, being a writer, the questions you ask and how you answer them are going to be influenced by who you are in the journey that you've been on as a human on the earth. But I don't think it's necessarily a thing that you have to do. Now, if you're a nonfiction writer, it would be good. If you're doing memoir or autobiography, you don't want to do a James Frey. I'll have to, or even what's the book American Dirt? You don't have to imagine, create a immigrant undocumented husband who's actually Irish and white, and what are we talking about? Like, you don't have to do that to make the story great. You know what I mean? I don't even know, can we talk about American Dirt? But
oh, do we have to?
Yeah, no, we don't have to. But I'm just saying, almost everything you write is going to have some of your sensibility in it, because you're the story, you're the god of that story. You're creating it and shaping it, and no one else is really going to do it the way you did it, because you are you. So lean into your voice, lean into the way that you see the world, and the questions you have, and the things that you find of interest, and the things that move you or trouble you. Lean into that, and that's going to imprint your storytelling. And then I can just say, as a fiction editor, I'm reading thousands of stories a month for the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, which has been around since 1949, that the stories that I actually take the time to read beyond the first paragraph or the first page are the stories that have a strong voice. But that's the kind of reader I am. I love voice, and I love character, and I love lyricism. Sometimes you can have a good ideal, but if it's not poorly executed, I'm not going to be engaged enough to read on to the end. So lean into what makes your work stand out, what makes you special in the way that you see the world. And I think that'll work well for you.
Oh, well, I think
That's quite the takeaway. You are the god of your story. I'm going to put that in the chat.
Yeah, I think we reached the end of our Wednesday talk. We were so happy to have you here. We want to read everything from you. We already started a few years ago, but we want every person in the program read you as well, because as you can see, there's a lot of enjoyment of dwelling in these topics, in these universes, in this imagination, and in this lens, not only from identity or futuristic landscapes, but of intelligence and brilliance and humanity. So thank you so much for being here. And we hope to have you in our program in another time. Here in Tepoztlán, in Mexico, that would be lovely, instead of this cyberpunk. Well,
bye everyone.
Goodbye everyone.